In the 1980s, a brochure was printed across the world for an idyllic holiday resort called Arous. It was a diving resort on the Red Sea in the Sudanese desert. The brochure featured pictures of chalets on a bright beach, the sea almost the same colour as the sky. There were couples smiling in scuba gear, exotic fish and water sports. It boasted that the resort had some of the best, clearest water in the world, and that once the sun went down, there were breathtaking views of the heavens, aflame with millions of stars. Tourists from Egypt, Britain, the US and many other countries around the world visited the diving resort on the Red Sea, which was renowned for its fresh food and wine and first-rate facilities. The coral reefs were said to be spectacular, and shipwrecks made for unforgettable diving experiences. But what guests of the resort didn't know was that Arous wasn't really a holiday resort, at least not primarily. And the staff weren't really managers or diving instructors or waitresses. Once the sun went down, those who worked at the hotel were part of a top-secret mission that not even their own families were aware of. And if the Sudanese government found out, it would cost them their lives. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Raffi Berg, the Middle East editor for BBC News. He has extensive experience reporting on Israel and the wider region. His book, Red Sea Spies, The True Story of Mossad's Fake Diving Resort, was written in collaboration with secret agents involved in the operation and tells the complete story of the case for the first time. His article, scratching the surface of this story, was the most read original feature in the history of the site, with more than 5.5 million readers to date. I want to start with a diving resort in Sudan on the Red Sea. Can you describe what this diving resort looked like in the 1980s and what was attracting tourists?
Yes, great question. The diving resort in the 1980s, to begin with, it was actually derelict. It was an abandoned, run-down complex which actually operated in its prime in the 1970s. It was originally built and run by Italians, but then it shut shop, and the Mossad stumbled across it, and for reasons which we'll come on to, they decided to refit it, turn it round, and operate it as like a Club Med style resort. Now, this was on the coast of Sudan, the Red Sea coast. It's a glorious spot of the world, because in those days, in the early 1980s, it was really unexplored. So, I mean, if you just use your imagination, you can picture these sandy, virginal beaches, beautiful sea teeming with the most glorious varieties of marine life. And it was incredibly appealing for adventurous types and especially people who were interested in diving. So people flocked to this resort from all four corners of the world, including from Australia.
Were resorts in Sudan like this common?
No, just the opposite. There was no place like it, especially not in Sudan. In the time period we're talking about, Sudan was actually the poorest country in Africa. So it was very strange to have a holiday resort of this standard on the coast, attracting tourists to the country. And as a matter of fact, foreign diplomats who served in the capital, Khartoum, they would go and vacation at this resort because not only was it a beautiful place to stay, but it was the only place to go on holiday outside of the capital. So they were frequent visitors, and we're talking about very high-ranking diplomats as well, people like the American ambassador, the British ambassador, diplomats from across Europe. It appealed to them and their families, and as I say, they were return visitors. The resort was described in brochures as unique in all the world, and it certainly was.
And what did the Sudanese tourism industry think of it at first? Because it wasn't run, as you say, by the Sudanese. It was someone else who came in and bought it and ran it. What did they think about it?
Well, Sudanese tourism industry is probably a little bit of an overstatement, because although there was a Sudanese tourist corporation, there was no tourist industry to speak of. People didn't visit Sudan. It was the poorest country in Africa. So when the opportunity came along for them to lease this derelict former resort to people who posed as European entrepreneurs, they were very pleased because it brought in hard foreign currency. But of course, what went on in this resort was covert operations and subterfuge, and all of it had to be carried out under the very noses of the unwitting Sudanese authorities, and remember, under the noses of the guests staying there themselves.
And within Sudan at the time, there were a number of refugee camps. In those camps were a number of Ethiopian Jews. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Ethiopian Jews and how they saw their historical and cultural roots?
Yes, so just to explain briefly, you're right. Sudan had a lot of refugee camps because the Horn of Africa had erupted into fighting and civil wars and famine. So people were leaving places like Ethiopia in large numbers and settling in Sudan. So refugee camps sprung up there. You asked me about the Ethiopian Jews themselves, and this is where it gets really interesting, because their origins are actually shrouded in obscurity. Nobody knows quite where they came from. There are a number of different theories. Perhaps the most exotic is that they are descendants of a union between the Queen of Sheba and the biblical figure King Solomon. But more recently, it's been accepted that they're actually descendants of a lost tribe of biblical Jews who disappeared into history some 2,000 years ago. But for many centuries, nobody even knew about their existence. And the Ethiopian Jews themselves, they lived quite cut off in the highlands of Ethiopia. They didn't know there was any such thing as white Jews. They thought they were the last surviving group of Jews in the world. These are black Jews, something that Europeans had never heard of. But later on, after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, there were calls to bring the Ethiopian Jews to Israel. But it wasn't until as recently as 1975 that Israel recognized them as Jews, and the instruction was given by a new prime minister in 1977, an instruction he gave to the Mossad to bring the Ethiopian Jews to Israel.
And why were they being persecuted in Ethiopia?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed picture. Or for a long time, they weren't persecuted in the way we are more familiar, perhaps, with a persecution of Jews in other parts of the world. They lived quite peaceably with their non-Jewish neighbours, although the non-Jewish neighbours, and we're talking Christian Ethiopians here, did treat them with a tremendous amount of disdain. They considered them actually supernatural beings. The Ethiopian Jews were known to the Christian Ethiopians as the hyena people, because the Christians believed that at night time the Jews would turn into hyenas and hunt down victims. In the early 1970s, there was a revolution in Ethiopia, and a new regime came to power. And it was anti-religion. And as a result of this, it really clamped down on not only religion in general, but the practices of the Ethiopian Jews, and life became very hard for the Jews. But it wasn't really as a result of the persecution that they made the journey to Sudan. if you have to picture your geography here for a moment, Sudan and Ethiopia are neighbouring countries. And the Jews ultimately walked from their homes where they'd lived for many centuries, hundreds of kilometres to get from Ethiopia to Sudan, to the refugee camps of Sudan. And that's where they were picked up by the Israelis and spirited out. But the driving reason, the motivation for leaving Ethiopia wasn't because life was so difficult there, but it was because they had an ancient dream to return to the land of their forefathers. And Sudan was the gateway which enabled them to do it.
And once they got to Sudan, were these people safe? Did the Sudanese treat them well, or were they met with sort of more danger there?
Just the opposite, very, very unsafe. It was absolutely perilous. First of all, the journey to get there. You have to bear in mind that emigration from Ethiopia was illegal. So making this tremendously difficult, this hellish journey on foot, they did it at the risk of their own lives. They walked up mountains, through rivers, through jungles. They had to avoid bandits. And 10% of the people who left Ethiopia, 10% of these Ethiopian Jews actually perished on the way. When they got to Sudan, the conditions there were even worse than the ones that they left behind. And they had to conceal their identities. They could not be open about the fact that they were Jewish. Sudan was an enemy Arab country, an enemy of the state of Israel. And when the authorities discovered Ethiopian Jews were in their midst, they would simply arrest them and they'd never be seen again. So they had to conceal their practices and their identities in the refugee camps, because they were also worried about being informed upon by their non-Jewish neighbours, literally in the tents next to them. It was very difficult, very dangerous.
Faraday Aklum was one of those Ethiopian Jews, and I believe it was in 1977 he was wanted by authorities for anti-government activity. What was he accused of doing?
Yes, quite right. So this chap, Faraday Aklum, he enters the picture, and really he is the key to all this, all that happens and unfolds afterwards. He was, as you say, an Ethiopian Jew. He had, for many years of his life, and he was in his early 20s in the period we're talking about now, for a large part of his life, he had wanted to get to Israel, but it was an impossible task. He was a Zionist. He promoted the idea of the state of Israel as a Jewish homeland, and because of this, he was a wanted man by the new military, anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist authorities, and he had to flee for his life. So he fled from Ethiopia. He was the first person to make the journey by foot, the first Ethiopian Jew, that is. Once he got to a refugee camp in Sudan, he sent a cryptic message to humanitarian agencies abroad, pleading for them to send him a ticket, an airline ticket to fly him out of the country. And this cryptic message landed on the desk of the Mossad. And that is how the Mossad and Faraday Aklum got in contact. And then, as a result of that, the Mossad began the business of finding more Jewish refugees and spiriting them out of the country in some of the most extraordinary ways.
Can you explain a little bit about what the Mossad is?
Yes, I refer to the Mossad this and the Mossad that. The Mossad is the Israeli equivalent of the CIA. It's their foreign intelligence agency. But perhaps it's best known for carrying out undercover operations which involve perhaps assassinations and operations which are driven by political reasons for the state of Israel. But this particular operation, which the Mossad led, was a purely humanitarian one. There was nothing political about it. No foreign intelligence agency had done anything like it before. So the Mossad was faced with a task, a mission to carry out that they weren't actually even structured, they weren't built for. But they carried it out nonetheless, and to tremendous success.
In late 1980, one of Mossad's operatives came across this abandoned resort in Sudan. What did he decide to do?
Yes, the reason it was discovered was actually, as you say, it was really by accident. The Mossad agent, who is somebody I got to know very well, his name is Danny, his first name is Danny, and he was the commander in the field. He was the person who the Mossad dispatched to Sudan to make contact with Ferideh Aklum. Now, once they had started moving Ethiopian Jews out of the country in undercover ways, and by that I mean that they were flying them out of Khartoum airport, but disguising them as non-Jewish refugees. As more Ethiopian Jews came into the country, the scale of the operation was too big to purely funnel them through Khartoum airport. So Danny had the idea of transferring the operation to a naval evacuation using the sea as an escape route. And it was when he was looking for a suitable landing bay that he stumbled across this resort that we keep talking about. It was about 50 kilometers north of Port Sudan, and it had been abandoned for a couple of years. And he had the idea there and then that if he could turn it round and relaunch it, the Mossad could use it as a cover for their activities.
What did the people who were employed by the resort, so whether it's a dive instructor or a waitress or a manager or whatever, did they know what the actual purpose was, or did they think they were working at just a normal resort?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because the staff at the resort, or at least some of the staff, were Mossad agents themselves. They masqueraded as diving instructors and manageresses. There were 3 women who were absolutely instrumental in the success of this operation, and perhaps we'll come on to those. The staff, such as waitresses, chambermaids, they were local employees, Ethiopians and Eritreans. But the diving instructors were all Mossad. They were actually former Israeli Navy SEALs, some of the best divers you can imagine in the world. One of the issues that the Mossad had, though, was with the local staff. Some of them were multilingual, so the Mossad agents had to be very careful as to what they spoke about out loud, because they could be overheard and the operation put in jeopardy.
I'm interested in the level of risk. These people who the Mossad sort of people there who were part of that operation, what would happen if the Sudan government knew what they were actually getting up to, that they were there to evacuate Ethiopian Jews? How would the government have reacted?
Well, it was incredibly dangerous. The agents were warned that if they were captured by the authorities, they were warned by Mossad HQ that if they were captured by the authorities, it was a one-way ticket. They would be hanged by cranes from in the public square in the center of Khartoum. So on the one hand, let's face it, it was quite a fabulous gig to get, working at a beautiful resort on a sun-drenched coast of the Red Sea. But there was ever-present danger, constantly dangerous. When they went out into the desert at night time to carry out their people smuggling activities, there were many, many occasions where it balanced on a knife edge, where they were almost discovered. To give you one example, they were transporting a convoy of Jewish refugees who were hidden in the back of their trucks. And it was an incredibly long journey to drive from the refugee camps to the coast was a distance of 900 kilometers. Well, on one of these trips, one of the Mossad drivers actually fell asleep at the wheel, nodded off. The vehicle crashed into some barrels. Now, the barrels were there because it was a checkpoint, and suddenly they found themselves surrounded by Sudanese soldiers pointing Kalashnikov rifles at them. The Ethiopian Jews were huddled without making a sound in the back of the trucks under tarpaulin. And the commander of the Sudanese troops went to have a look at what was the cargo, and he almost lifted up the tarpaulin. And at that point, the Mossad commander indicated to his colleagues that if the soldiers uncover the Jews in the back of the truck, the Mossad agents there would have to, in his words, take them out. They would have to be killed. And that would have scuppered the entire operation, as you can imagine. At the last second, the Sudanese commander pulled his arm back and didn't bother lifting up the tarpaulin for whatever reason and sent them on their way. But there were many instances where what they were doing was almost exposed, highly dangerous.
After that close call, when the Sudanese government started to sort of clue into what was going on, they actually pivoted their operation a little bit, didn't they? And that's when they started to experiment with maybe airlifting the Ethiopian Jews out of that coast of Sudan.
Yes, it wasn't so much to do with the Sudanese authorities getting clued into what was going on, but they almost did. One of the naval evacuations was actually discovered by a platoon of Sudanese soldiers, but the soldiers didn't realize that these were refugees who were being smuggled out by sea. They just thought that what they had come across were perhaps arms smugglers or smugglers of contraband. So the Mossad got away with it. They were actually ambushed on the beach, but they managed to defuse that situation without being completely exposed. Nevertheless, the risk was brought home to Mossad HQ, and they decided to switch the operation from naval evacuations to airlifts. And so began a period of flying in Hercules aircraft, huge aircraft which would fly all the way from Israel, some 2,000 kilometers away, again, all under the cover of darkness, flying low, so low that they were under the detection range of radars. These planes would come in, hug the mountains. There was a chain of mountains running along the Red Sea, so incredibly perilous for the pilots of these huge Hercules. The Hercules would land in the desert. They would rendezvous there with the trucks driven by the Mossad agents, which were carrying hundreds of Ethiopian Jewish refugees. The refugees would be put onto these planes, which would then fly out of the country again. Now, also, you have to put yourself in the mind of an Ethiopian Jew who had come from a different type of civilization. And these people didn't know what planes were. They didn't know what electricity was in many cases. They hadn't seen a motor car. And they were being asked to enter the belly of a huge, noisy, metal-winged bird. In fact, at least one of them described it as like being like a Jonah, the biblical figure of Jonah, entering the belly of a whale.
How were these Ethiopian Jews getting the message to get to this resort? Because I understand going from the resort to Israel, but how was the message being disseminated that they had this option and this operation was taking place?
Well, the Ethiopian Jewish refugees didn't actually pass through the resort itself. That operated as a base for the undercover Mossad agents. The Jews were transported from nearby up the coast, where, as I've described, the Israeli Navy ships would come in and collect them. But in the refugee camps, which were hundreds of kilometers away, there was a network of Jews, a small network, which some were appointed as contacts people, and they would meet with the white Israeli Mossad agents. Again, all done at night time. Mossad agents would tell them when the next evacuation was due to take place, and then this cell of Ethiopian Jews would very carefully spread the word that there was going to be a transportation, and they would compile a list of refugees, and at the 11th hour, they would take them from their tents, rendezvous with the Mossad agents. The agents would then put them onto the trucks and drive them either to meet the aircraft in the desert or to meet the Israeli Navy ships on the coast.
And towards the end of 1984, the evacuations began to escalate, and Sudan's president secretly agreed to have the Ethiopian Jews airlifted out of the country. How was that story eventually leaked?
Well, quite ironically, it was leaked by the Israelis themselves, ultimately by the then Israeli Prime Minister, Shimon Peres. It had become known, it had got leaked to the press, and the Israeli Prime Minister decided that the best approach was to call a press conference and to talk about it in a limited way. So it became known, but that was not until the operation had managed to fly out some almost 7,000 Jews. It was a huge operation. It goes by the name of Operation Moses. This is a famous airlift which was top secret at the time, but has become known about since.
And why was the resort itself eventually evacuated by the Mossad?
In 1985, in April 1985, there was a revolution in Sudan, and the old regime was swept away. But some of the former intelligence agents who were loyal to the regime, they started to spill secrets, and one of them had information that a network of Mossad agents was operating in the country. Now, he decided to trade this in exchange for being spared prison time, but it didn't help him ultimately. But nevertheless, the new authorities realized that Israel was operating there, and this information got back to the Mossad HQ in Tel Aviv. They decided it was too dangerous to continue, and they gave the order to the Israeli agents at this diving resort to evacuate with immediate effect. But it wasn't possible because this was Easter time and the resort was absolutely full of guests. So the staff couldn't just disappear. They had to wait until the last guest left the resort at the end of the week. And then with the guests gone, the agents told the local staff that they were going to go away for a couple of days to look for a new diving spot. And with that, they disappeared off into the desert. And as I describe in the book, Israel dispatched a plane to pick them up in a very knife-edge moment, which was highly charged, full of drama. By the skin of their teeth, the agents got out of the country before they could be caught.
I wanted to ask about some of those women who were part of running the hotel and their role in the operation. What did they do during those years?
Well, This is an extraordinary story altogether and an extraordinary operation, but none of it could have been possible without the participation of a group of women. It was a very male-dominated undercover operation, but it was decided at one point to recruit a woman to operate as a manageress at the resort, because it was figured that this would lower any suspicion. If you have a lady at reception, perhaps it would allay suspicions rather than if you had a man serving there. This was the thinking behind it, but it was quite touch and go. The Mossad chiefs didn't really want to bring a woman into such a dangerous environment. But there was an individual who was recruited. Her name is Yola. I met her, I know her very well. She is the most wonderful human being, a real humanitarian in every sense of the word, and she's incredibly formidable. If anybody could pull off an operation like this, Yola is a person who could do it, and she did it in spades. She turned this resort around. If it wasn't for her, the resort could never have functioned. She was incredibly capable, very, very resourceful, bright, intelligent, a warm, lovely human being. The local Bedouin, by the way, who lived in and around the area of the resort, they used to go to her at the time because they found her so helpful, so resourceful, and they nicknamed her the Iron Lady. The Iron Lady was a name which was used for a former Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir. Golda Meir was the first and still the only woman to ever be Israeli Prime Minister. Yola was tremendously admired, and because of her, the operation was a resounding success.
In total, in those 5 or 6 years, how many refugees were saved thanks to the Red Sea resort?
Well, in the periods covered by my book, which is the story of the resort, some 7,000 Jewish refugees were brought out of the country by covert means. And picture this, before the operation began, there were about 36,000 Ethiopian Jews in their entirety, a very small population, literally on the brink of extinction. But today, as a result of what the Mossad managed to achieve and subsequent secret operations, there are some 140,000 Ethiopian Jews living in Israel. And I think it's safe to say that as a result of this, their future is really secured.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Red Sea Spies, the true story of Mossad's fake diving resort, is available at all good bookstores, online, and via the link in the description of this episode. You'll find more of Raffi's work, including the original article he published for the BBC, in the description of this episode. For photos, maps, and further information on this story, you can join our closed Facebook group. Search True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.